if this is your first day at Marxism, welcome to the festival. Nice to see some people from yesterday as well. I am Jack, I'm from the Leeds branch of the Socialist Workers' Party, and I'll be chairing today for this meeting, October 1917, Coup or Revolution, which is the first of a three-part series, three-session series on Russia in 1917 and the key arguments around that. So this meeting will be led by Skye Harrison, who is from our Manchester branch and is active in a lot of LGBT work in Manchester as well. Skye will speak for about 30 minutes, then we'll have time for some discussion in small groups, and then we'll bring it back to the wider room for contributions, and then Skye will sum up again at the end. That is everything from me, so take it away.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I hope there's one lesson that you can take from this, which is about revolutionary discipline, and let's be honest, a 10 a.m. start after maybe some of you have been drinking shows that at least I have a lot of confidence in that when the revolution does come, at least some of you will be there on time. So I want to start out with the big picture, which is that the Russian Revolution is by far one of the most misunderstood events in working class history. From all sections of political life, you'll see different interpretations of the events. And you'll see condemnation thrown at the Russian working class Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And there are almost as many interpretations of the events of 1917, 05 and earlier as there are colours of the rainbow. And I'll start by going through a handful of them. By far the most popular shade of this rainbow is kind of like an ugly blue, if I'm really honest, which is sort of the bourgeois historian angle. And this is really the primary interpretation of the British state, right-wing historians, and I would argue the primary view of the revolution as we see in society today. And in this, the school curriculum teaches 16 to 17-year-olds, and I think into university as well, that the Russian Revolution was a bloody coup that ignored the wishes of democracy from the working class. It ensued a Red Terror, which repressed and oppressed the working class, which led to a bloody civil war, which was valiantly fought by the king of conservatism, Winston Churchill, who dispatched troops from across all the democracy-loving countries to liberate Russia. People like to say that Lenin and Stalin's grip was so strong over Russia, and they were too weak to fend off the ensuing terror of Bolshevism. Lenin died. Oh, look, see, everybody is here on time. Revolutionary discipline. People like to say that goodness me, that Lenin died, planted the seeds for Stalin's power, and both ruled as vicious dictators. Yeah, let him come in, yeah. No, you're right, Scotland. Alright.
That was a short meeting.
You're all late, you missed it.
Cool. Now that we've got a room twice the size of audience, welcome everybody. If it's your first day at Marxism, welcome to the whole festival. Lovely to see so many people. And some of you might have deja vu for the first 3 minutes of this talk. But Skye Harrison is here to talk about October 1917, Coup or Revolution. This is the first in a three-part series on Russia in 1917, addressing some of the key arguments. Skye is a comrade from the Manchester branch of the Socialist Workers' Party, and will speak for about 30 minutes. Then we'll have maybe 27 minutes now. And then we'll have a quick kind of icebreaker type discussion with the people near you, and we'll break it out then into wider contributions and questions. Skye will summarise at the end, and we'll all have a lovely meeting. So, take it away.
Well, I think the people who came here on time will find it very funny that I started by saying that this meeting will hopefully teach you about revolutionary discipline and who will be on time to the revolution. Not looking too good for some of you. You might miss all the fun bits. Never mind, I'm going to start by simply saying that the Russian Revolution is by far one of the most misunderstood events in Britain, in working class, international working class history. All sections of political life have their own interpretations. It was almost like a rainbow out there of the different shades and interpretations of the revolution. I mean, I'll go through a handful of them shortly now. I mean, obviously some of you have already heard the first interpretation. I mean, by far the most popular, I'd like to say, is the sort of nasty blue image of the revolution, which is sort of the most popular, taught by bourgeois historians, taught by our school education system, which is the idea that the Russian Revolution was sort of a bloody coup, that it was that ignored the will of the working masses, that it was the overthrow of Tsarism, that it was sort of a history of a small group of people, a small minority, seizing power on behalf of the masses, forming a clique that allowed Stalin's rise to power, the Red Terror, to ensue bloody repression and oppression, all against the will of the working masses. I mean, certain sections of the left will actually agree with this interpretation. It is by far a very popular interpretation of the events, and I mean, especially from sort of autonomous aspects of the left. But I mean, this meeting isn't for it, but the key idea that is placed in our heads by the British ruling class, the international ruling class, and our school education is that Lenin was a tyrant, laid the seeds for Stalin, who was also a tyrant, and they would argue that this is the case of all party organisations. And I mean, if you want to hear more, please come to the following meetings on the Russian 1917 course. It's really useful and I think an incredibly important lesson for all revolutionaries to learn. And I want to give you actually a little bit about the opposite side of the rainbow, sort of the quite nasty red, if that's a possibility. In that there are actually some aspects of the left who would say that 1917 was, well, a little bit of a coup, but they don't actually think that's too much of a bad thing. I mean, there's some Stalinist traditions who would actually say some really disappointing things about the Russian Revolution. I'm going to quote one without throwing shade at them because I don't think that's really appropriate. But one Stalinist group says that the Bolshevik Red Guards took control of the Winter Palace and crushed the anti-communist white opposition, whereas the February Revolution saw an end to Tsarist rule. The October Revolution sought to unite the Russian working class under one ideology of Marxism, Leninism. That's boring, right? Like, united under one ideology. I mean, far from Marxism or Leninism, Marx called revolutions the locomotives of history, of advancements, and of worlds worth living, not simply some sort of shared, dogmatic ideology. I mean, Lenin himself called revolutions the festivals of the oppressed, rather than some stale, top-down affair of red and white guards. Fundamentally, both accounts miss the key aspect, which is of the Russian Revolution, which is the self-emancipation of the working class, led in part by the Bolshevik Party and its ideology of Leninism as party organisation. But as Marx understood, it's not revolutionaries that make revolutions, but ordinary working class people, like ourselves, like we saw in Russia. I mean, I've talked enough about what other people think. This isn't some sort of study on what everybody thinks about the revolution. Let's see what we think about the revolution. So, let's actually first go back 12 years before the revolution took place and look back at the 1905 revolution, which was the first, well, one of the first revolutions that gripped Russia under Tsarism. And it was just at this time Russia had faced complete humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War, which was started as the ruling classes argued, as some sort of noble conquest that was rapidly overturned, seeing the support of the conflict abandoned by many of even the high levels of the Russian ruling classes and their international supporters. It was a pure slaughter, humiliation, and so intense that what would crown the ending of the war was that there were sailors on board warships who simply said, look, we're not going to fight in this conflict, we all know that we're going to be sailing towards our death. Specifically, mass strikes swept across Russia after this conflict had sort of reached its most bloody conclusion. 12,000 people struck in a factory following the victorization of many trade unionists in that factory, and this would light a spark that would then spread across Russia. I mean, firstly, the uprisings were against the Tsar in 1905, and they were completely unexpected by Russian revolutionaries. I hope this is another lesson that you take from this meeting, is that we don't have some magic crystal ball. We can't predict or see what's going to happen. We can only react to when it does, and hopefully keep on top of what is happening within the class. And I mean, it was completely unexpected, as we'll see, and this is a very common theme of class struggle. I mean, who today would have thought that a year ago we had the RMT out on strike after selling out completely in the P&O dispute only a few months before, and this would lead to the largest strike wave that we've seen in 30 years. Simply put, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. All we can do is react to the manifestations, agitate, and try and bring them towards their most revolutionary conclusion. Goodness me, I wish that I had my notes in order. I think that it's important to introduce you to this time of the idea of what a Soviet is. We know this is also one of the most widely misunderstood aspects of the revolution, in that if you follow sort of the McCarthyist, James Bond interpretations of a Soviet, they'll tell you it's a person. Maybe in a funny hat with a star on top and a hammer and sickle. And in fact, by far the opposite is the case. And this is what we saw, and one of the key lessons from the 1905 revolution. And in that a Soviet is not a person from Russia, but instead a collection of organised people who organised to run the society democratically, who elected deputies to go meet, to debate, and decide a strategy to move forward. I mean, Soviet translates to governing council in Russia, or more simply, as we would describe it in English, a workers' council. In this, they're a way of running society, or your workplace, without bosses, without leaders, but instead with the collective decisions of the working people elected to that organisation. I mean, I'm not going to lie, when these workers' councils sort of started to spread and mushroom across 1905, the revolutionaries were really sceptical of these organisations. We had never seen something like this before. We had quite an idea of what a revolution would look like, looking back at the Paris Commune, looking back at the French Revolution, but to see organic working class bodies was very unexpected and met by a lot of scepticism and sectarianism, even from Bolsheviks at the time. And Lenin himself was sceptical to these organisations, and it took him analysing and understanding them as an embryo of a provisional revolutionary government for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Well, Lenin initially, then later to win the Bolsheviks to the idea of what a workers' council could be. I mean, when I say at the beginning that Marx called revolutions the locomotives of history, 1905 epitomises the locomotives of history. I mean, firstly, its spontaneous and speed and aggression of the side of the revolution is one thing we can clearly take from it. Secondly, is the instrumentation of instruments of workers' powers, meaning the Soviets. And then also, one of the key lessons that revolutionaries across Europe and across the world took was the power of mass strikes and mass workers' organisation as a tool to cripple the working class, something they just simply hadn't seen on that scale yet. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg talks about this in her text, The Mass Strike, which is now available from bookmarks for only £5. A great small pamphlet to learn about mass strikes, and it's obviously increasingly relevant to today. And I mean, 1905 did something that the Paris Commune of 1871 didn't, and it presented that simply when working class people are given an inch, we can really take a mile, and that's by boarding the locomotive of history that Karl Marx talked about. And I mean, Vladimir Lenin states that the revolution was a festival of the oppressed and the exploited. And I mean, no time had we seen this before, with working class people coming to a position of power in society, coming to the fore and actively acting as creators of their own new social order. And for Lenin, he understood that to bring about socialism, to bring about workers' democracy, struggle and workers' participation, including all sections of working class and the oppressed, was able to create a world to win, as Marx talked about. And I talk about how we can take an inch, we give it an inch and we can take a mile, but I mean, the same is true in reverse. I mean, often we'll attribute that quote to the right wing and the ruling class, and tragically 1905 is a clear example of this. The repression of the revolution was fierce, it was defeated in bloody, in bloodshed, and the grip of the Tsar was simply too strong for the newly formed Soviets to handle. I mean, as Trotsky at the time, who wasn't a Bolshevik, he was actually in the Menshevik party, he stated that the power still has to be snatched from the old rulers and handed over to the revolution. The position of workers' power and bourgeois power existed simultaneously, causing an irreconcilable paradox and one must come out victorious in a revolutionary situation. In the case of 1905, revolutionaries were forced underground, there was a bloody campaign of repression, workers were murdered on demonstration, specifically 1,000 people attempted an insurrection in Moscow, but it tragically was defeated. But I want to say that although this is quite a bleak picture of initial revolution 12 years before the October Revolution, it's important to state that one of the most important lessons of 1905 was the ability to win. I mean, the Bolshevik Party went from a handful of thousand to 46,000 in the space of a handful of months and years. Simply put, the Tsar had been forced to submit his powers to the pseudo-democratic Duma, which is some sort of like a constitutional democracy. It was a pitiful and allowed more votes for certain sections of society. But simply put, this all-powerful Tsar had to abdicate a certain amount of his power, not all of his power. We saw a Bolshevik Party grow exponentially. People were looking towards revolutionary socialist ideas. But really importantly, the working class have learned what defeat would look like. The working class learned that when we lose, damn well are we going to repeat those mistakes again, and obviously, tragically, we do repeat those mistakes again. That was one of the arguments that the Bolshevik Party made in 1904 in the writing of one of Lenin's pamphlets, What is to be Done, that we need to look and study history to understand that we can not make the mistakes of history, but instead to learn and to drive forward. And I mean, it was Lenin who called the 1905 Revolution the Great Dress Rehearsal, which I think epitomises this idea of working class people learning from their defeats. And he clearly states, in 1917, the victory of the October Revolution in 1917, without 1905, would have been impossible. Now I'm sure we're 10 minutes in and you're a bit worried that I'm losing focus, but it's precisely the lessons from 1905 that taught the Bolsheviks, the lessons from revolution, and fundamentally that workers' revolution is possible, and impossible actually, without the participation of the working class. And now the locomotives of history, instead of carrying through change and liberation, were crashed straight first into a wall. All the trains were cancelled. I mean, it seems quite reminiscent of our current situation. But like I say, the fundamental lesson was that a revolution could not be had without mass strikes, without workers' organisation, and without the participation of the working class. I mean, war broke out in 1914. We saw the start of a huge inter-imperialist conflict. And I mean, there's much better meetings on inter-imperialist conflicts that you can go over the next few days. But I mean, a fundamental thing that we learned from the outbreak of the war was that actually there was a massive uneven spread of ideas when it came to this war. Russian socialists who had first stated, we'll never participate in war. War is nothing but evil and bloodshed. They all went, shit guys, let's actually back this war. And that left Lenin and the Bolsheviks in a minority where they stated no to the war, turn the guns around, turn this imperialist war into the class war. And at this time, actually, many of the Bolsheviks were forced into exile, fleeing from the repression of the Tsar. And actually, at the outbreak of the war, we saw mass rallies in support of the war in Russia. And I mean, tragically, at this point, Trotsky had stated that Europe had become a gigantic slaughterhouse as the ruling class enjoyed the comforts at home and regular working class people were sent out into no man's land to be massacred. And with many of this, many men were sent abroad to fight and die in this imperialist war. I mean, Dave Sherry, in his text, highlighted that this actually led to a key significance of women workers back home, and especially in Russia. And Alexandra Kollontai, one of the Russian revolutionaries, used this as a time to sort of understand the role of women in society and the idea that women under capitalism must bear a dual burden of labour. And this is especially intensified by war, with women having the labour of work and then coming home and having the labour of the household. I mean, women in Russia often would work 10-hour shifts in grueling conditions, then have to come home to the unpaid domestic labour of the household, such as cooking, cleaning, and raising children. 100 years later, that sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? See, the Bolsheviks were unique in this analysis, and many actually socialists completely disagreed and would state that women were some of the most reactionary elements of the working class and were actually incapable of revolutionary sentiments. But the Bolsheviks disagreed, and Kollontai was key in organising women in their own union in 1916 called Soldati. Comrades can do the pronunciation on that one. And I mean, in fact, the socialists who looked down upon women were proven starkly wrong in 1917, where we saw the second revolution in Russia, the February Revolution in 1917, and angry at the living conditions, 2 million Russians slaughtered in the war, the lack of bread, and the 23rd of February, Russia fell back into revolt. And I mean, Trotsky stated that the February Revolution was begun from below, overcoming the resistance of its own revolutionary organizations, the initiative being taken on their own accord by the most oppressed and downtrodden of the proletariat, the Russian women, textile workers, and simply put, the most oppressed members of Russian society had enough. And spontaneous protest, walkouts from work and taking to the streets was the order of the day. And in fact, initially, they filled roads and downed tools alone. However, this changed starkly with women workers organising and going to different factories to agitate upon the men, going, look, we're out on strike, we don't want to see the mass murder in Europe, we don't want to see the huge queues for bread, and we want to down with these prices. They would throw stones, snowballs, and really whatever they could get their hands on at the windows of the factories to call men out to fight back. And this was really a spontaneous uprising. But at the core of this were the women Bolsheviks and supporters who had organised within the Women Union in 1916. And truly, the February Revolution was the return of the festivals of the oppressed, as Lenin argued. And look, less than 5 days later, learning from the lessons of 1905, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' Deputies had returned. And the next day, the SOAS ministers were arrested. 3 days later, a general strike and Soviets organising disaffected workers arose, and including that, 70,000 armed troops had joined the side of 400,000 workers in Moscow. A day later, the Tsar had abdicated, only 1 week before seeming completely powerful. I mean, look, I've said before that Karl Marx said that revolutions were the locomotives of history. This is a bloody fast train. If in the space of less than a couple of weeks, we saw an all-powerful Tsar abdicate Tsarist ministers in disarray and under arrest, and workers forming a new idea of organisation through the Soviets that they had learned from 1905. But what's really different about the 1917 revolution compared to 1905 is that they had huge massive support from the soldiers. Seeing 2 million Russians die in the trenches and on no man's land allowed the working class to see that this war wasn't a war of noble pursuit. It was an imperialist war, it was a class war, and instead of dying and fighting for imperialism, many soldiers had joined the side of the revolution. I mean, I'm trying to rush through this, I've only got 10 minutes remaining, but simply put, a new government was shortly set up after the abdicating of the Tsar. I mean, however, this revolutionary government was far from a revolutionary government that we would like to see. It wasn't based upon the Soviets, and instead this provisional government was formed by an opportunist pro-capitalist group like the Constitutional Democrats. I mean, in the first mass meeting of this new government, one heckler had asked the key member of the self-appointed regime, Milukov, who elected you? And simply put, in a panic, he blurted out, we were chosen by the Russian Revolution. I mean, you see, revolutions are far from one harmonious progression towards socialism. Like the Stalinist quote I gave you earlier, there was not simply some sort of unification of ideas. Instead, there was mass contestation of ideas in this revolution. And it isn't one nice harmonious march in red guard towards socialism. Instead, just as capitalism is uneven in its development and ideas, so is revolution filled with contradiction, debate and struggle. And there began the key contradiction of the Russian Revolution. And there began to be workers' power based on the Soviets and the democratic running of society. I mean, we saw Soviets not just in Petrograd, which had been named to St. Petersburg at this time, but we saw them in Moscow, we saw them in even some of the most smallest cities with factories. And we saw this counterposed with the organisation of the bourgeoisie, the provisional government, which at every turn attempted to kettle and control the revolutionary ideas of the working class. The February Revolution had seen slogans which were bread, peace, land, and end to the war, and in fact the provisional government had given them nothing of the like. I mean, even one of the leading members of the provisional government stated that Russia would fight to the last drop of blood. And I mean, really, at this time, the seeds of the third revolutionary were sown within Russia. I mean, once again, the Bolsheviks were simply a minority and argued for a rejection of provisional government and establishment of true workers' power, even in the face of that split organisation. The Mensheviks and other groups had all rallied behind the provisional government. And there was even a struggle within the Bolshevik Party, far from some monolithic organisation. In April, Lenin had put forward an April thesis, which had called for the end of the war and an establishment of workers' power. It took the entirety of April for Lenin to win that position within the Bolsheviks, and that was to whip an idea of workers' power, which to revolutionaries like us today seems like a very basic understanding of revolution. And at this time, the Bolsheviks sought to rearm, to prepare themselves, and prepare the working class for insurrection, for revolution. Oh, goodness me, about 10 minutes left, and we've only hit April. And the peasantry at this point, alongside the soldiers, were in complete revolt. It wasn't just working class people. We saw mass abandonment of the front lines. We saw land seizures from the landlords, and we saw the role of the soldiers becoming a key question for the Bolsheviks. The provisional government had aided this sort of dissatisfaction of the soldiers, massacring 40,000 of them in the June offensive, and the Bolshevik influence within the soldiers became really rather strong, to such an extent that many of the Bolsheviks were actually completely willing to take power in July. We had the machine gunners regiment argue quite openly, yeah, we want to seize power, we've got the guns, we think we've got the people. But in actual fact, a key argument was made within the Bolshevik party, which was simply stated by Lenin in his July Days text, in that the Bolsheviks must hold back to build within the working class, to solidify the ability to throw over the provisional government, because they knew that if they seized power in Petrograd through a coup-like formation, they may have held Petrograd for a few weeks, but the Bolsheviks and the working class were much weaker in Moscow. They were much weaker in other towns. To allow Petrograd to be isolated would doom the revolution and form a new type of terror, and that would be a terror of reaction, a terror that would lead to the return of the Tsar to much worse. And in this time, in the build-up to the October, I mean, terror was unleashed upon the working class by the provisional government. Against leading revolutionaries who were forced to flee Russia. I mean, Lenin had only just returned to Russia after the February Revolution, was forced then to flee back to Switzerland. I think at this time, Trotsky had a warrant out for his arrest. Revolutionaries were facing a murder and repression. And at this time, a leading general in the Russian army, Kornilov, who was a far-right general, sought to overthrow the weak provisional governments as he advanced his battalions and harder soldiers onto Petrograd. I mean, at this time, if Kornilov had taken power, we'd have seen mass reaction spread across Russia. Not only were the gains of the February Revolution to be rolled back, but even the possibility would have been that it had been worse than the Tsar. But to protect this, the provisional government had united with, sort of in a united front, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, in order to hold back the coup. Goodness me, I'm running out of time. But importantly, the Bolsheviks were key in holding back this spread of reaction. They were on the front lines. They had soldiers who had been, one to them, dying to fight off this reactionary general. And really, the ideas had started to change in that time, and leading revolutionaries had started to win the favour of the working class. And albeit aboard secret trains, Lenin, many leading Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries returned to to Russia. There's a really quite nice video of Patrick Stewart dressed up like Lenin, receiving flowers and congratulations from Soviets. And this isn't just some sort of picture, this is a genuine event where to see Lenin, to see the Bolsheviks return to Moscow, a lot of praise was given to them. And I mean, the Bolsheviks knew that they couldn't just seize power immediately, and instead they had to lay a trap for the provisional government. They couldn't just march onto the Winter Palace and take power. They knew that they had to be far more strategic than that. And in fact, they allowed that to take place. After the withdrawal of Kornilov, the provisional government sought to solidify its power. They shut down the Bolshevik press, the printing press. They sought to arrest key leaders of the Soviets, and instead of falling into line, the soldiers rebelled. They were foolish, the provisional government were foolish to believe that the soldiers would remain loyal to them after seeing the massacre and the bloodshed, and instead the guns were metaphorically turned around. And I mean, we must be clear that by now the Bolsheviks had organised an attempt to seize state power and to storm the the Winter Palace. I mean, this was no mass event. I'm not going to lie to you, the storming of the Winter Palace was not millions of workers, but instead thousands of workers. And at this time, it was organised by Leon Trotsky, who was the sort of elected president of one of the Petrograd Soviets. I mean, the question lies unanswered. I mean, I've only got 5 minutes remaining, but was this a coup? I mean, simply put, the Bolshevik Party was no tiny clique built around Lenin. Unfortunately, the Socialist Workers' Party was nowhere near the scale of the Bolshevik Party at this time. The Bolshevik Party was a mass organisation of thousands and thousands and thousands of workers built upon workers' power through the Soviets and through the workers' organisation. It was a highly democratic organisation in nature, and rarely was there even consensus on strategy in moving forward. Lenin was far from a dictator and was actually often in a minority within his party, having to fight hard and facing really quite vicious attacks from members of his own organisation. He was forced to argue his position, and he was forced to win. I mean, large sections of the Soviets were Bolshevik-led at this time, fought through the respect that they gained to the repelling of Kornilov, through the repelling of the offensives on the front lines, and simply put, the basis of workers' power was sown to the Bolsheviks' respect in the Soviets. The storming of the Winter Palace was nearly bloodless. I mean, more people died in the production of a film commemorating the revolution in the 1920s than actually in the events itself. Leon Trotsky talks about it very beautifully in his History of the Russian Revolution, but simply put, very few guns were fired, and if they were not aimed at people's heads, but instead as a means to scare and to force the White Guard to surrender. The antagonism between workers' power and bourgeois power was finally reconciled. Instead of being a position of dual power, like Lenin argued, the provisional government was overthrown and an establishment of workers' power and workers' democracy was achieved. And we must also state that revolution isn't just one moment in history. The October Revolution wasn't just the storming of the Winter Palace. I mean, revolution is the self-emancipation of the working class, the creation of a new order and a society based on working power. I mean, Lenin argued that the storming of the Winter Palace was but the crowning act of the revolution, but not the revolution in its entirety. The rebuilding of the Soviets, the moving towards the Soviets in the role of state power, the women workers striking, the overthrow of the Tsar, the rebellions in the military, the turning around of the guns against the rulers and turning the imperialist war into a class war, that was the revolution, not a simply one moment in time. And I mean, alongside this, we saw nearly instant victories. I said many times that revolutions are the locomotives of history, and 1905 epitomised this, February 1917 epitomised this, Russia in October 1917 epitomised this further. Not only had women taken part in the storming of the Winter Palace in February, but women were key to organising this new society. The rights of the oppressed were not only embraced, but so much more was won. The nucleus of liberation was achieved. There's a beautiful book on your right there, The Women's Revolution, where it talks about the mass gains of women in the Russian, in the newly elected Russian workers' democracy. 2 months later, after the establishment of workers' power, homosexuality was decriminalised. 50 years before Britain had even partially decriminalised homosexuality. Abortion was available, nearly on demand. The nucleus of liberation was the word in the street. Simply put, Russia 1917 wasn't some stuffy affair. It wasn't just a unification of ideology into Marxism-Leninism. It was a self-emancipation of the working class, the highest point in human history. I'd like to say the highest point in human history so far, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sky, for a fantastic introduction. So for the next 2 or 3 minutes, if you just turn to the people next to you, chat about the meeting, what you thought, maybe start thinking about any questions you might want to ask for the follow-up at the end. Hear such active discussion going on in our first session when normally people are still kind of warming up for the day, so that's lovely to hear. What we're going to do now is move into group discussion, so if people put their hands up to indicate, I will call on people in kind of pairs, so I'll let you know when you're coming up. I will try and fit everyone in. We've had some really busy meetings yesterday and it's not been possible to get everybody finished, but I will try my best. If we try and keep contributions to 3 minutes max, they don't have to be 3 minutes if you just have a question. I'll give you a reminder by just rapping on the table when there's 1 minute to go, and then at 3 minutes I will ask you to sum up, just to allow people to have space to continue discussing. But from there, yeah, if you have anything you'd like to contribute, just put your hand up and I'll call on people. Right at the front, and then I will call on Comrade at the back there.
Can I start? Yeah. Just want to, it's really just a question, so it should be quite brief. I was hoping to understand a little bit more how we define the words coup and revolution in the context of if you like, there were some assumptions made in the speech, which, and from my perspective, because I'm not a scholar, it would be nice to understand exactly how we define these terms in the context of 1970 specifically.
Thank you very much. Comrade at the back, and then I'll call Comrade in the mid.
Yeah. I think we all know that there was a great liberation in October 17, and we also know, unfortunately, that there was a lot of repression in Russia not too long after that. The only question I have is, what was the time period between one thing and the other? No, between the liberation and the repression. How soon? You know, and why did it happen so quickly? I know there were reasons why it happened, but why did it happen so quickly? Thanks.
Thank you. Comrade in the middle here, and then Comrade in the back corner there. Just on the end, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Sky, for that really good introduction. I think what I took from it that was really, really important is that it's not just going to happen overnight. It's not going to be just one day where we all decide to go out on strike, which is important, but it's the idea that it's a whole process, and I think that is really relevant to today in terms of, you know, how we're seeing a wave of strikes, how we're seeing people sort of become more acquainted with the idea that you have power as the working class, and I think that's really important because I think right now we're living through a period where when people become familiarized with these ideas, it's understandable that people need a win, but it's looking at, you know, situations like 1905 and understanding that sometimes revolution won't just come immediately, but it takes learning and it takes obviously looking at history for that to happen. And I think it was Lenin himself that was actually arguing that he was never going to see a revolution in his lifetime, which is really funny because I think he said that like pretty much right before it happened. But what is really important to me, and I think it applies to today, is two things. I think the first one of them is that we can't be ambitious enough in the sense that, as Kai has outlined, they could have compromised in so many occasions in the sense that they could have just said, okay, well, the Tsar's gone, I guess we'll just have some reforms, maybe like men will get voting rights or women will get the vote, and that's better than what we had. But I think it's really important how they said, well, we're not just in it for sort of the breadcrumbs, but we actually wanted the whole thing. And it's important how they got to the root of the problem, which was the system, if you will. But I think also really relevant is how they took in stride the demands to end oppression, because it would have been so easy for the Tsar or for the provisional government or for anyone after that to crush the revolution by trying to divide everyone and appealing to the idea that well, women are earning less than you, so why would you unite with them when they're the problem? But they took all of those ideas in stride, and they said that it was always going to be the unity of the workers that were going to stamp out the system and not just some selected elites that were intellectual and could lead. So I think those two lessons are really, really important for today because we see huge debates around how to go forward and should you settle for something that is better than what you have but not exactly the best deal that you could get? Should you leave people sort of behind because it's too ambitious for right now? I think we need to make these arguments and bear in mind that we have won them before and we will probably win them again if we keep that in mind.
Come right to the far corner there, and then I'll call on comrade here with the...
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm Tomasz. I work for the Socialist Workers' Party. I just want to make 2 points. Firstly, I think Russia's important because it cuts to the heart of the issue. What do we mean by revolution? I think revolutions are normally presented as carried out by a small minority of people with berets and guns, seizing power on behalf of the masses, the people, or whatever one wants to say, and then bringing in political reforms from the top down through a new regime. But that's not what we mean by revolution. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky said, a revolution is the forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own lives. In other words, it's a mass democratic event where you see mass collective action by working class people taking power into their own hands and taking collective action. And that's what Russia was. It's not presented like that, but when you look at the actual history, that's what takes place. And within revolutions, people begin experimenting with new forms of democracy from below. And in Russia, it was the Soviets, the workers' councils, but we've seen that in other revolutionary situations. In Sudan today, people have set up resistance committees in the course of the struggle. And I also think when we talk about revolution, it's not just about a political change, it's also about trying to change the very structure of society. You can see the potential for that taking place in Russia. But I think the second kind of important thing is the question of organisation. Because there have been many revolutions where people set up their own democratic bodies and there's the potential for them to take power, but they don't actually take power. You don't see that revolution succeed and the working class in the cell. And that's because, I think one was successful in Russia, is because you had the Bolshevik Party, not an enlightened minority acting on behalf of people, but they waged an argument within the workers' councils, within the Soviets, that said, these bodies aren't just about organising the resistance, aren't just about organising in the here and now. They can become the basis for a new democratic work, to say, from below. And they need to take on the existing state, smash it, and replace it. And that question is still, crucially important today. Because you need the mass spontaneous action, and we can still take that from Russia. But also, unless you're organised, unless revolutionary sectors want to get rid of the system organised, it's not inevitable that people actually end up doing that.
Coming inside here, and then coming at the front.
Thanks very much, Guy. I really enjoyed that introduction. I thought you made it so fresh and lively and relevant. I just wanted to address the question of what's the difference between a coup and a revolution. And in my understanding, a coup is a minority, a small group of people carrying out a plan, a programme on behalf of everybody else. And the majority of us are passive and either cheer on or oppose or whatever, but our actions don't matter. And I think, to me, looking at what happens in the most oppressed and most marginalised communities helps us to see that the Russian Revolution was not a coup. And my special interest is women, and as Guy said, women, start the February Revolution by going on strike for International Women's Day, against the advice actually of the local Bolsheviks, who said, wait for May Day, don't be too impatient, don't go for it, and the women listened politely and said, get lost with their day, and quite rightly so, because they spoiled the February Revolution. But after the February Revolution deposed the Tsar, there was a period where the provisional government, the liberal hopes of the world lay on the government. They were going to introduce democracy, freedom, get rid of the Tsar, and the Soviets, who were developing a kind of dual power. And throughout the summer of 1978, it was women workers, the laundresses who went on strike, the most repressed, the most downtrodden, led again by Bolsheviks, the soldiers' wives who had an appalling situation, millions of men missing, dead, their pensions cut and so on, they began to look to the Soviets, and their actions were crucial in moving power away from the provisional government to the Soviets. And if women weren't involved like that, then you could say maybe it's a coup, maybe it's a change at the top that doesn't. But it involved a massive stirring up of the bottom, of people raising their own demands, of transforming themselves as they transform society. The provisional government failed, and that's why the Bolsheviks became a majority. They didn't seize power, they didn't have tanks and guns, they didn't have prisons, they didn't have the mechanism of the state, they only had their arguments and their ideas, and they won the majority because the provisional government failed, because they were trapped between the idea of a bourgeois democracy and the idea of the Soviets. And when pushed, they were on the wrong side, because it was Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, who invited Kornilov, who made him the chief of staff, this right-wing general, who would have taken Moscow and Petrograd, who would have brought in a repressive regime. And it was because Kerensky realised that he'd unleashed this kind of right-wing monster, he let the Bolsheviks out of prison, where they were. He released Trotsky, and it was Trotsky, Lenin and the Bolsheviks who defeated that coup and proved, demonstrated in power and in practice the need for organisation. And it was that that led to them winning the majority of men, women, ordinary workers, of soldiers, their wives and the peasants, and that's why it's a revolution.
I'm going at the front here and then at the back.
Thank you. My name is Sheila McGregor, and I'm from the Tower Hamlets Socialist Workers Party. And I wanted to come back to the question of the person next to me about the difference between a coup and a revolution. And I'd like to raise a question about the nature of capitalist society. It's also true of the previous class societies. But actually, it's about social relations. We're talking about fundamentally two different classes. So we're talking about, in the situation of Russia, of the workers' movement in its upsurge, and I'm not going to repeat what Sky and Judy have said, actually the dynamic led by the workers, with the soldiers and with the peasants, and actually begin to catch fire in the oppressed minorities in the prison house of nations that was Russia. This dynamic of revolution, which was involving masses, millions of people. On the other hand, we have a ruling class that wants to maintain power. And when you talk about dual power, crystallized with the provisional government which comes out of the February Revolution, and the workers' councils and the soldiers' councils, and councils being developed in the minorities and the oppressed nations of the Russian Empire, when you begin to see that emerging, they're contesting who is going to rule. Under those circumstances, either the workers lead and break the power of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie, of the landlords, of the oppressors. Either they break their power, or if the oppressors come out on top, they break the power of the workers, the soldiers, the national minorities, and therefore they break all the oppressed as well. And that is what is at stake in a revolutionary process. And Kornilov wanted to organize a coup. He was about organizing a coup on behalf of the landlords, the oppressors, the ruling class throughout the prison house of nations, and continuing the war. Because actually the provisional government had said, we will continue the war. They had said no to the right of self-determination of nations. Never mind the question of women and oppressed people within the society. And therefore, under those circumstances, either the workers, through their democratic organizations of the Soviets, moved forward to stop Kornilov and then to take power, or they lose absolutely everything. And that is what is at stake in those circumstances. And actually, the reason that the revolution was not a coup in October was quite simply, it was led by the workers' councils. Trotsky, as the chair of the Petrograd Soviet, organized through the Petrograd Soviet the defense of Petrograd and the defense of the workers' councils. They were the ones. It was the workers who switched the tracks, the points on the tracks, so the railways carrying Kornilov stopped and they couldn't go any further. It was workers' power that actually stopped Kornilov. And it was that workers' power that meant the expression of that through the decisions of the Workers' Council meant that they could then surround the palace, take the provisional government, arrest them and march them off, and then take over the whole of Russian society. So that, for me, is the difference. The coup is the ruling class wanting to break and smash and introduce reactions throughout the whole thing, and the revolution the October was the culmination of the democratic workers' struggles and peasant struggles and national minorities and women, as Judy has talked about. That's for me what it is.
At the back. And if people have questions as well, you're welcome kind of short contributions as well. You don't need to kind of fill the 3 minutes. Sometimes you might just have quick couple of questions that you might want to ask.
Yeah, I think mine will be short because Sheila just like half my contribution. I mean, Sheila was also talking about the dynamic between Coup and the organisational roles of the working class. I also think it's important to remember what the environment was like for people. This is a time when ideas are being challenged. This is a time when people had the ability to express themselves, feed on different information, find different things out. For a country where the literacy levels were so low, this was a place on every street corner. People were reading every single pamphlet they could get, every single leaflet they get, because they wanted to know more, and things were progressing so fast. It's funny when we talk about Lenin had to win people over a short period of time, over a long period of time, but we're actually talking about the space of like 5 months in terms of actually going from the initial February Revolution to October. And I think that dynamic, and as Thomas said earlier about the spontaneity of the women coming out and actually taking that position to go on the strike and then feed into the different workers going on strike. Actually, there's an element of spontaneity, but this was the culmination of a lot of ferment, and the Bolsheviks being able to crystallise that mood and take that forward to actually reach its end conclusion of overthrowing the state. But we have to acknowledge as well, actually, the Bolsheviks were quite behind the working class at times. There's a caricature here of Lenin and Trotsky. You know, if you read like Robert Service's absolutely horrendous books on Lenin and Trotsky, where there's these bloodthirsty kind of revolutionary leaders who came in, and all these working class people had great ideas, and they came in and they just took over and they did whatever. Actually, Lenin had to argue against his own party. Trotsky joined later on, and people continually argued against Trotsky thereafter that, as we all know. And the working class were ahead of them, and Lenin and Trotsky had to come away, and other members of the Bolsheviks had to come away and go, why are the working class ahead of us, and why do we need to catch up with them? Because the mood and the temperament and the will of the working class at the time was so far ahead, and the Bolsheviks had to catch up. And that's an important thing to remember. People wanted change, however, it needed the theory, the understanding, and the knowledge of the Bolsheviks to do that. So why do people call it a coup? I think for me, this is the one totality of a revolution where we can say this is where working people took power. And what does that do? That challenges every single idea of capitalism as the most natural existence to working class people. And capitalism is it's the best we've got. We can't get anything else as the best we've got. So it challenges that idea, because when you actually give people the option and the power that they can make decisions for their lives, they will do something else than sitting and live in a world where there's oppression, tyranny and exploitation. And that's what the Russian Revolution does. And it showed you could do, and that's why people want to call it a coup or bastardize what the actual meaning of it was.
Very much. At the front here, and then I'll call on.
Yeah, I'm just going to touch on what a lot of other people were speaking about, and I think what was really important that came out of Sky's talk is the nature of revolution and the nature of the revolution in Russia in 1917. And I think a lot of the criticisms on the October Revolution in 1917 come by seeing it in a very short lens and seeing it as, you know, yes, a couple of people storming the Winter Palace, and then that being that, and then they're in control of the state. But in reality, 9/10 of the revolution had already been completed. And as revolutionary socialists, we don't see revolution as others have mentioned, as a single event that happens on one day and then it's, you know, the world is changed. We see it as a lengthy process involving, you know, months and or even years, with, you know, a process where the mass of the working class are mobilized in action with, which is characterized by mass strikes, occupations, mammoth protests, and so on. And I think it's also worth going into, you know, why is this the case? I think it's the nature of the working class to struggle collectively workers are pulled together and pushed together in ever larger concentrations. And we see that today, don't we? We saw that yesterday when Chris Smalls and Darren from Amazon were talking about the large concentrations of workers that come together. And it's in these large concentrations that workers have to pull together and fight together. And in that collective process, the collective nature of struggle, it then leads to, the start of the process of uprooting the social relations that underlie the capitalist system, the relations between a worker and a boss, and so on. And workers really start to take power for themselves and so on. And I think, but it's not a homogenous process, and I think Sky outlined that, and others have outlined that really perfectly. Through this struggle and through taking revolt, the working class cries out for an in-depth understanding of the real nature of the state and the law, which is constantly being used against them. And I think people who understood that the best were Marx, through the process of learning the nature of the state in 1871 during the Paris Commune, where hundreds of workers were slaughtered by the French state. And then Lenin then also understood this, not through reading books and sitting in a library all day, but by going through the process of the 1905 revolution, and then going through the process of the revolution between February and October. And you see that in his publication of his famous pamphlet, State and Revolution, which he published late that year, before the October Revolution. And I think that's how the Bolshevik Party led. They didn't lead through, simply having good ideas, but they led through as an example, creating facts and stating and proving their leadership day after day after day. And it wasn't just, Lenin and so on, it was people following them as well. And that's, I think, important thing to point out.
We're at the front here and then at the back in the middle.
I just wanted to piggyback on what another comrade was saying earlier, sort of about revolution within a more modern context and how do we set the scene for that now. Obviously, it's a very different situation, and I think organisation is important, having the right frameworks in place, very important, but it's also important to remember that, especially in this country, we're fighting against quite an embedded mindset, which is very anti-disruption, and it's very anti the idea of a revolution, of strikes even, and it's sort of bearing in mind how we can take steps to combat that, because oppressors use very convincing language to illegitimize the anger of workers and the anger of the oppressed. They call us violent, they call us disruptive, they call us selfish. That's, I've heard people use that kind of language about strikes and about picket lines. And how do we combat that? You come out very, very vocally in support of strikers. You turn up at picket lines. You come out in vocal support of Palestine and Palestinians, basically anyone who's being oppressed. And obviously, if you haven't already and you want to get involved in that kind of stuff, one of the best ways you can do that is by joining the Socialist Workers' Party, because that's what we do best, arguably. That's it.
Right at the back in the middle, and then I'll down the road to you.
I would just like to say that, as a lot of comrades have pointed out, the fact that the October Revolution actually included women in the forefront, like Con I think Scott mentioned as well. And I think that's one of the most revolutionary things, is that it included women at such a prominent role and made sure that it didn't just question capitalism, but like the intersectionality between the patriarchy and capitalism.
Thank you very much. We're in the middle, and then coming at the front will be our final contribution. Sorry, I've not had a chance to fit everybody in. But I will be around for a chat at the end, and I'm assuming you will as well. Yes, go ahead.
And so, first of all, thanks, Guy, for the talk. Really interesting. Thanks, everyone else, for the contributions as well. Basically, when I was talking here with some of the people next to me, one thing that was brought up was the situation today. Like, people feel a bit like having the security and the confidence in yourself to actually be part of things like striking and taking workers' action. It's quite difficult, and so what I wanted to ask was, how do you view the parallels between, and let's say the similarities and the differences between the, the situation in Russia in the early 20th century, and today, is that harder today, or is it easier today, or is it, both in different ways? What would you think about that? Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. Come right at the front here.
Thanks. Well, look, we celebrate the Russian Revolution in October 1917 because it gives us a glimpse of a different world. Because after that revolution, workers, people, like ourselves, who do all the work, take over running society directly. And lots of gains made that people have discussed, really, putting on the agenda complete change. But what's really interesting in how it's presented today, and often the February Revolution, 1917, is portrayed as completely separate to the October Revolution. February was good, October is bad. February is a mass revolution, October is the Bolsheviks in a coup, which is like a minority. And what I think we're drawing out in this meeting is how they are connected through a process of revolution. And the February Revolution gets rid of the Tsar. Now that is no mean feat. The Tsar had ruled for decades with utmost repression. Fantastic. But loads of questions are not resolved by that. The brutal war of the First World War continues. Workers demanding better bread and wages, the peasantry and the land. And so it's not the case that then there's a revolution and then nothing happens. There's an ongoing process of struggle throughout 1917, more strikes like people have described, the peasants actually burning down their landlords' houses sometimes, carting out bosses from the factories in wheelbarrows, I think it was called at one point. There's a process of struggle. And crucially, there's something called dual power. The workers that were in part running society through the Soviets, direct organs of workers in their workplaces, directing the economy, taking decisions. But the state is still there. And the old structures are still there. So there's two powers in society running. And which side is going to win? And quite rightly, someone mentioned State and Revolution that Lenin wrote. He didn't just write it as an academic exercise. He's writing it in the height of revolution, in the summer of 1917, to think, how can the revolution go forward? Because it's not just going forward. There's also attempts by the bosses to take back control. And he's really arguing that actually, we can't just take over this existing state. We have to get rid of it completely and have a different sort of world where workers are running it directly. And this is an argument the Bolsheviks are putting in the Soviets to workers involved in the struggles. And eventually they win a majority in just before the October Revolution, where they won people over through the process of struggle, interaction with argument to that. And that's when the October Revolution takes place. And it's done under the banner of the Bolsheviks say all power to the Soviets. They're saying all power to the workers, really. They don't say all power to the Bolsheviks. It's actually to the idea that workers themselves, through the Soviets, are going to run society and get rid of that old, the capitalist state that some people are trying to build. And I think that is worth defending. And there's lots of myths put out there because, of course, today people don't want us to take inspiration from the idea that we could run society ourselves. And I think today, obviously, the world can look quite differently, but we still have big workplaces, people brought together, a class society, a state that tries to repress us, but we're also seeing some forms of resistance, aren't we? The highest number of strikes in the last year for 30 years. Riots on the streets of France after the police shot dead at point blank range a young person. Actually, that's my time. Sorry, I'll stop. But the point is that I think we have to draw lessons from that in order to think about how we can organise today to go forward, but learn that it is possible for our side to actually run society directly ourselves.
Perfectly timed. Got about 10 seconds left. Oh, good.
Thank you very much, everybody. Excellent discussion and contributions. Thank you. And I'll leave to Sky to sum up.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. God, thanks for the very fruitful discussion. But I think it shows you that there's a lot to learn from Russia, a lot to take, a lot to maybe let go, but move forward. I'm not going to comment on Coup Revolution, although that is obviously the title of the meeting. I think the comrades explained that very well. I'd like to thank them for going through that. But fundamentally, coup, very small number of people, berets, guns, although, I'm not opposed to guns. Berets, if you're tasteful with them. But revolution is a mass movement of ordinary people going to the fore of society, directing straight forward, fighting, winning, and gaining so much more. A comrade asked, how soon was the repression? I'm not going to lie to you, it was tragically very soon. The repression was brought about by an intense civil war. If you want to learn about this, go to the next meeting. I haven't got that much time to talk about it. Simply put, 17 imperialist armies, including Winston Churchill's British army, when he was the foreign secretary, invaded a society that had already been ravished by war, was ravished by yet another war, and counter-revolutionary insurgents were filling Russian society. I'd like to say that at the same time as that, did the Bolsheviks ever let go of women's liberation? No, they didn't. Did the Bolsheviks ever let go of the Soviets? No, they didn't. And every time the Bolsheviks, when they offered the chance to consolidate their own power, they stuck to their ideas of workers' power and all power to the Soviets, as they'd argued. That changed under Stalin. That's not my meeting. Go to the next meeting if you want to learn about that. But very simply, despite their intense contradictions of a war raging inside their own country, ravaged by 17 countries, on the brink of revolution, went, shit, these guys have a picture of something beautiful. We have to smash it. We're all at risk if this happens. We cannot let an international revolution take place. 17 imperialist armies invade. The only way to protect Russia was to not only try and spread the revolution, which they attempted to do in Germany, tragically unsuccessfully, but also to have an unfortunate repression inside the state. And I mean, I want to talk about ideas changing and the Bolshevik Party itself. I mean, yeah, like one of the comrades says, the Bolsheviks didn't have guns and tanks. In fact, Trotsky outlines how he has to go and order secretly, I think it's 10,000 rifles, because they were looking around going, we haven't got any guns. Well, I'm sorry, but a revolution, when you're facing brutal repression from the Tsar state, it isn't bloodless always. The Winter Palace insurrection was relatively bloodless, but they didn't have the means to simply do a coup. In fact, they were offered the opportunity in July. They were offered probably, well, in 1905, we saw 1,000 people try and form an insurrection in Moscow. And then they were unsuccessful. Lenin vehemently argued that if they pushed forward for a premature revolution, they too would be unsuccessful. Not only that it would not be an institution of workers' power. And in fact, the Bolsheviks might not have had guns or tanks, but they had something far stronger. They had the working class behind them. They had the organized working class. They had working class power, in fact, to such an extent that they could overturn a state and build a new worker state in the image of that. I mean, I'm going to talk about some books right now because I understand there's a lot of students in the room. I think that you benefit from it. Liam's right to talk about state and revolution. In fact, Amy actually has a very good YouTube video talking about state revolution 100 years after the Russian Revolution. I'd recommend everybody watch. State revolution is a very short pamphlet in which, bookmarks actually sell it, I don't know how much it is, about how workers can analyse the state, how we can understand the state as a contradiction between workers' power and as a tool of oppression and how to overcome it. I mean, the books up front are excellent. Russia, 1917 by Dave Sherry, extremely concise, extremely valuable. A Women's Revolution by Judy Cox, who spoke about the women fighting, and then History of the Russian Revolution, if you really have all summer to read about Russia, because it's a big book. Nonetheless, learning about the Russian Revolution is paramount for socialists today. It's paramount. I mean, I want to talk about the similarities and the differences, but simply put, I don't have time. The similarities are that the state is still strong and still an organ of class oppression over us. The similarities is that when workers fight and organise, as we're seeing, they show their power. What did COVID teach us? I think Lewis Nielsen brought this out in the opening rally. COVID taught us that who runs the society? Ordinary working class people like us. It wasn't the bosses stacking the shelves. It wasn't the bosses who were asking for PPE. It wasn't the bosses who were sorting out the queues for our vaccinations. It was ordinary working class people. And I've got 5 minutes, so I'll wrap it up quite shortly. What I think epitomises that this was a revolution was the achievements of the revolution. If you're in the morning meeting on the Pride Politics pamphlet, you'll hear what I said about the Russian Revolution for LGBT plus people. LGBT plus people fundamentally were not talked about or known particularly 100 years ago in Russian society. In fact, a little homosexual world existed in Tsarist society, and it was pushed to the corners. The Russian Revolution decriminalized homosexuality 2 months in. In fact, we saw the nucleus of trans people coming to exist in Russian society. Lev Rosenstein, as David Sherry talks about in his book, as leading psychologist, stated that women in Soviet Russia may legally take men's names and live as men. This is 100 years ago, and we're seeing the festivals of the oppressed. Winston Lenin states that he wasn't just throwing it out as a cheeky quote. It's a great quote, put it on your Instagram. But fundamentally what he's saying is that when working class people, the women revolutionaries, when we're talking about the right for nations to self-determine, where these people are organising the society, the society is based on them, it's based on workers' power, and that's fundamentally what we want to achieve today. Lauder talked about not just fighting for crumbs, which is what the Bolsheviks argued for. In fact, if they only fought for crumbs, we'd have saw a massive reaction. We would have seen the provisional government overturned by Kornilov. We'd have seen reactions spread Russia. In fact, there's a very beautiful quote by, I don't know if it's Trotsky or Tony Cliff. He stated that if the Civil War was lost by the Russian revolutionaries, fascism would not be an Italian word, but a Russian word. Because fundamentally, the stakes that we have are socialism or barbarism, as we saw from Rosa Luxemburg arguing. And when I say that we're not just fighting for crumbs, we are fighting for the entire bakery, and I think workers' power shows that completely. In fact, we're not even fighting for the entire bakery, because what makes a bakery work? We're talking about the workers who harvest the yeast. We're talking about the workers who mow the fields and get the flour. We're talking about the workers who get the salt from the sea. We're talking about the workers who pick the sugar from the plantations. And we're talking about black workers making yeast. We're talking about disabled workers getting the sugar. We're talking about LGBT workers in the factories. We're talking about every single section of society organising and fighting together. Because if one worker goes, nah, I'm not making any yeast, you can't get bread. If one worker goes, I'm not getting the salt, you got some really crap bread. Working class people make our society, and that is what workers' power is. When workers organise, we understand that we're a collective, and we organise in a form that is workers' power, we can win so much more. And this isn't just some natural idea. This is what makes it different to today, and what makes the Socialist Workers' Party so key. The Russian Revolution would not have happened without the Bolsheviks. In fact, the fact that all the other socialist parties backed the provisional government proves that explicitly. The Russian Revolution was built by workers, but it was the guiding force of the Bolshevik Party. It was workers uncompromising that ideology, fighting and debating within the working class. If this was a clique, it would have gone so much smoother. If this wasn't a democratic organisation, the coup would have been clear, and we would have seen a very different turn of events. The fact is, it took so long, not only because the working class was uneven in its development, but also because the party itself had to fight arguments. And that is what we need today. We need an organisation like the Bolsheviks, and obviously everybody is here, has been to a million meetings, and what we need now is not just workers on strike, which we need, not just workers organising in workers' council, which we need, not just revolutionaries being the recipients of the oppressed, which we need a fighting force that can drive a revolutionary wedge, a red wedge, into the working class movement and fight for so much more. If we allow Mick Lynch to just have what he wants, we'll have sell out, sell out, sell out. But what we need is win, win, win. We need workers' power, we need a workers' organisation, and that's what the Socialist Workers' Party is. And I want to leave you on a simple quote, which is Tony Cliff, who is a founding member of the Socialist Workers' Party. We are a party of leaders, not an individual. And he stated that we're all in this together, but only when we fight together. We have to fight together as an organised working class, fight together with a unified message. Because if we don't do that, we'll see reaction, we'll see barbarism, we won't see socialism. We're fighting for not just crumbs, we're fighting for bakery, we're fighting for every method of production. And the only way we can do that is by organising, fighting together, and by joining the Socialist Workers' Party.